Good evening. I'm Camilla Carl-Von-Flynn, Deputy Chairman of the Lincolnshire branch of the English Speaking Union, and I'd like to welcome you to our 6th online discussion since we started these back in November 2020. And I would be now delighted to introduce Matthew Christmas, who is the Head of Engagement at the English Speaking Union at Dartmouth House. Matthew has been head of the debating team that travelled internationally, so he is a long-time member of the ESU. He started debating when he was 14 and has been teaching for over 30 years. So he is one of the best placed people to introduce our guest speaker, Sir Jon Coles, this evening. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Well, we're delighted to be joined in conversation today with Sir Jon Coles, and it's really great to welcome you all here to this Zoom, and for those of you who will watch this on the recording. Well, Sir Jon is the Chief Executive of United Learning. That's the largest academy trust in England, and there are some very big trusts. It's a group of over 80 academies and also independent schools, established originally 130 years ago. And today's discussion could not be more timely, as yesterday the government published its first education white paper in 6 years, with a full commitment that by 2030, all pupils in England and Wales will benefit from their school being part of a strong multi-academy trust, such as Jon's. And today it's also set out a green paper to review special educational needs provision. There's a lot going on in education at the moment. Now, after passing the 11 plus, Jon went to Judd's School, a voluntary aided grammar school in Tunbridge, Kent, and he claims that he was the geek's geek. In 1990, he was awarded a place at Mansfield College, Oxford, from where he graduated with a first in mathematics. He then studied teaching at St Catherine's College, Cambridge, studied teaching before a master's in philosophy at the University of York. So Jon originally qualified to be a teacher, but actually started his working life at the National Audit Office. But then in 1997, just as Tony Blair's new Labour government came to power and was soon shouting out education, 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 Jon joined the Department of Education. And he served in that department for 15 years with enormous distinction. The last 4 on its board as Director General for Schools and for Education Standards. And one of his key successes was delivering the government's pledge to cap infant class sizes at 30 pupils. He also served as Director of 14 to 19, leading work to increase participation and attainment in education and training post-16, as well as being the Director of the London Challenge. This was a key government initiative, developing and implementing the much copied strategy to improve schools, in addition to introducing the Teach First scheme. And I have worked with many Teach First students, thanks to the work of Sir Jon and others. In 2012, Jon left the civil service and became the CEO of United Learning. He also chaired the school's collaborative charity, Challenge Partners, for 10 years from its inception, and is now its honorary president. He's a trustee of the Prince's Teaching Institute and a council member of King's College London. And not surprisingly, and well-deserved, in 2019, he was knighted for services to education, but it is always too modest to mention it. His career in education has been hugely varied, allowing him to see both sides of both policy and also classroom practice. And we'll explore tonight how that has shaped his thinking. So, Jon, you're very welcome. And I'd like to, as they do in Desert Island Discs, take you back to the beginning. So Jon, you come from a family where you've stated that education was the most important thing. Could you perhaps start by telling us a little about your family background and why it was that education became this driving force in your life?
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's slightly tiring for me. I don't know what it was like for anyone else. Yeah, I mean, I should say, I mean, I grew up in a family where nobody had been to university. All my grandparents had left school by the age of 14. So when I say that education was the most important thing, I think what I really mean is it was the most important thing to my mother, who in truth was the, force that shaped my childhood, really. She really had been denied a place at university because actually her father was ill, and the view of her family was she needs to go out to work. And so in a way that, I mean, perhaps people are not so dutiful nowadays, but perhaps people's attitudes are a little bit different as well. You know, after A-levels, she went out to work, and I think she wanted for her children, you know, the opportunities that perhaps she hadn't quite had, and emphasise always the importance of education and the opportunities and life chances it would bring. I'm not sure she really intended for that to shape my thinking about my career so much as my thinking about, you know, the next few years. But I think in truth, it probably did shape my thinking about my career, because I have always had this kind of central view that education really is the most important thing that we can do to shape the future of the world and the future generations and the future of our country. And that's what I've spent my life doing. So yeah, but in that way, most important thing.
So John, you joined the Department of Education and were there 15 years, and there were some hugely significant changes at that time. So did your teacher training, which you'd done, and your own education experience as a boy at school and a young man at university, did that inform your policy work in the DFE in any particular ways, do you think?
I think particularly my training as a teacher, actually, although, as you say, I didn't really then go on and you know, teach as a career. The time I did spend in the classroom did shape my thinking, I think, in a significant way, because there were lots of things about my experience which I thought showed that the education system wasn't really very well designed to make it as likely as possible that teachers would succeed with children. And I do think, you know, the most useful and natural way of thinking about educational improvement is thinking about what makes it more likely that more teachers succeed with more children. You know, what are the things that you can do which enable teachers to enable children to succeed? And so actually my experience of training to teach and spending time in the classroom teaching whilst training was formative in that way. I must have been a you know, terrible person to train to teach, because I would often ask questions like, well, how do we know? How do we know that's the right thing to do? Or you know, what does the evidence tell us about what is the most successful way of doing that? And you know, and it was very clear that actually that was a very difficult thing for teachers to engage with and find out. And there were all sorts of things about the conditions in which people worked which made it less likely that they'd succeed than was necessary. So that really did, I think, shape my, you know, my approach to the policy work, really.
And what policy change, I mean, I know you're a modest chap, but what policy change are you most proud of? You think that was really worth doing, and I'm pleased with the reaction and the results?
Well, it's the London Challenge, because, I mean, it's not, the London Challenge isn't really a policy in quite that way, because it's much more like a strategy. It's, you know, it's the combination of multiple policies and changing a number of things in a kind of synchronized and coordinated way in order to shift the performance of London schools. And, you know, if we think back to, you know, 2001-2, where we were starting to think about that, Tony Blair had just won a second landslide and had heard on the doorstep a great deal about quality of schooling, and had been challenged a lot by people, particularly in London. And of course, you know, people's journalists, or, you know, and politicians and influencers, you know, live to a disproportionate extent in London. And their view of what the national education system was like was disproportionately shaped by their view of what their local schools in London were like. And so there was this kind of disproportionate sense that, you know, schools, secondary schools in particular, were terrible because people believed that London schools were terrible. and were seen as problematic and were performing much less well than the national average. And so, the task was pretty clear: improve London schools. And there wasn't much more definition than that, really. And it was a great thing to work on, because people can always argue, are exam standards the same as they used to be, or are things comparable to the way that they used to be? But what you can do when you're responsible for a kind of big region, or a big city in this case, is compare standards in London to standards in the rest of the country. And people can't really argue that you're not measuring like with like. You're measuring everyone against the same standard. And over the period of London Challenge, London schools went from being near the bottom compared to all other regions to being the highest performing region in the country. And again, sort of measurable. And I know exam results are not everything, but they are a measure of something important about people's knowledge and understanding. And so, that transformation, I do think it is, looking back on it, it is a transformation in standards in London from, in that bottom group of lowest performing parts of the country to being the highest performing parts of the country. Is the piece of work I'm most proud of.
That's had a huge effect. So, but obviously in 2012, you began to practice what you preached, if you like, by moving from the civil service to working directly with schools. And you've been with United Learning since 2012, and you're still there now. It's now the largest academy trust. And it's a very old organisation in that respect, very much like the ESU. And like the ESU, I think it works with both state and independent schools. And I think it's fair to say that most people today in education and in other sectors would agree that partnership is the key. And I know you talk a lot about that, how your sectors and other groups work together. Could you tell us a little bit about United Learning, what drives it, and talk about how your state independent partnership actually works in practice?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. I mean, we're a very unusual academy trust because we've lasted about 120 years longer than the Academies programme so far. And that's because, yes, we were founded in the late Victorian period. It was a time when obviously society was waking up to how big a problem it was that there were so few opportunities for girls and young women in education. And the foundation of the Girls' Day School Trust, Newnham and Girton in Cambridge, and the growth of higher education for women, was all part of that mid to late Victorian movement, trying to tackle this problem of lack of educational opportunity for girls and young women. And so, we were very much part of that. That was our foundation. We were founded as the Church Schools Company with a view to offering a sort of Church of England alternative to the slightly more secular Girls' Day School Trust. And over time, over the next sort of 100 and so years, the organisation grew and shrank a bit. We founded schools like the Abbey School in Reading or Church High in Durham, which are not now part of United Learning, but are very successful freestanding independent schools. And we kept this core of independent schools, which over time, some of them, Guildford High School, Surbiton High School, have remained all through girls' schools very much on the model that they were founded, but others have become co-educational, some have some boarding, and so on. So we've had this core of schools that have been with us for a very long time. And when the Academies programme was coming along in 2002, the concept really was that there'd be a small number of these schools originally. They would be focused in areas of severe deprivation. They would be a turnaround school. There'd be heavy investment in a new building, in new leadership, and in improvements in educational standards, focused on schools in the toughest areas where often for a generation they'd failed children in the area. So that was kind of the Mark I Academies programme. And the DFE then approached our then trustees and chief executive and said, well, would you sponsor an academy? And I think trustees genuinely did reflect, well, what would our founders have done? And I think quickly came to the view, well, actually, this organization was founded to tackle what was then the biggest social problem in education, lack of opportunity for girls and young women. Well, what's the biggest social problem in education now? Well, I think 20 years ago when this conversation was happening, and still I would say today, it's poor schools for poor children. That's the biggest social problem in education. And therefore, of course, we as an organization should contribute what we can to solving that problem. So, you know, the first academy, Manchester Academy, took over from Ducie High School on Moss Side, which, you know, was notoriously difficult and disorderly. And, you know, over time, 1 became 2 and 2 became 3, you know, 3 became 17, you know, and we were, you know, quickly becoming one of the significant sponsors of academies, and very much on that sort of Mark 1 model of academies, turnaround schools.
And John, you've talked a lot about how both sectors benefit from each other, and it's definitely not a one-way, the state learning from independent. Can you say a bit more about that? Because that's a really important thing.
Yes, and perhaps you know, that isn't a natural thought to everyone, but I think it is a natural thought to some people. They, you know, if I take some examples within the trust, so Guildford High School on our independent school side, it's one of the highest performing schools in the country. It's consistently is at the top of the league tables and the top sort of half dozen schools in the country for GCSE and A-level performance. Over a period of years, it worked immensely closely with Paddington Academy. Now, Paddington took over from a school called North Westminster Community School, which I think may be the worst school I've ever visited when I was doing London Challenge. So long before I was doing this job, you know, it was genuinely disorderly. I think visitors often felt slightly terrified in the corridors because of, you know, the level of kind of disorder and rushing and running and pushing and you know, you could go into a classroom and find a, you know, teachers smoking with their feet up on the desk, and so that you know, really kind of serious problems. And so Paddington Academy now has taken over from that school. It's an outstanding school. It's a kind of inspiring place to visit. It has the same children. It even has some of the same teachers still. It just has a completely different culture, level of expectation, you know, different practices and behaviors and so on, and you know, extremely polite and well-mannered children. Now, Guildford and Paddington have worked together, you know, particularly in those early years, worked really closely together for, you know, over a period of time. And Fiona Bolton, the head at Guildford High School, Ollie Tomlinson, the head at Paddington, you know, were people who hit it off and worked closely together and shared ideas and practice. And you could visit, you know, the school and see something slightly unusual and say, well, what's happening there? And you know, Ollie would say, well, I got that from Fiona, or Fiona would say, I got that from Ollie. And, you know, there'd be a genuine sharing and collaboration. And I think it comes from the fact that, you know, to run a very good academy in a challenging area, you have to be extremely good at some things. Typically, you have to have very good, sharp systems and processes which you apply extremely consistently. You have to be extremely good at inducting and training your staff. You have to be very good at making sure that whenever anybody joins, they have an extremely, you know, thorough training in the school systems and processes. And they have to be consistent all of the time. So you have this tremendous drive towards systematic practices, towards staff training and development, towards real consistency in absolutely everything you're doing. And often independent schools, you know, are quite a different pole from that. They run a great deal on ethos, and often there's quite a lot of ambiguity, and people are expected to behave well in ambiguous situations, but they often have a kind of depth and rigor of, you know, academic practice that, you know, underpins the curriculum. And, if you're in a school like Guildford High School, well, if you're going to be successful there, you are going to have to be an academically extremely strong teacher. So you can see, I think, that, once you start putting these things together, and actually start debating and sharing practices, you see that, two people who are really trying to do the same thing, but approaching it with different assumptions and different expectations and a different kind of mental model of what they're doing, if they can get together in a kind of context of trust and openness, then, often they can learn a huge amount from each other. So at its best, the collaboration between the sectors really is a genuinely two-way process, often on sort of moving away from Paddington and Guildford, which I think in most respects are really exceptional schools. I would say that, actually contrary to what many people think, teaching and learning can be the weakest part of an independent school quite often. Yeah. And, and you can't get away with poor teaching and learning or adequate teaching and learning practice in a tough inner urban school and be successful. So there is a genuine two-way learning, which, has been very powerful for the group.
An important view, yes, absolutely. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, everybody, I'm going to mention the C word very briefly. I don't want to dwell on COVID too much, but I think we all agree that it made education visible to everybody in a way it perhaps wasn't. And books like Who Needs a Teacher? I've Got Google are well thrown in the bin. I think whether you work in the system or not, you cannot fail to have seen the impact of school closures, exam cancellations, and lost learning. And that's very much at the heart of the government's new white paper. So John, how did you see the pandemic impacting on your learners right across the country? And what did you do as a trust to try and mitigate that?
Yeah, well, I often say that young people have done a national service, really, over the last couple of years. And I think that is an accurate way of seeing it. We mustn't forget that most young people were really not personally at risk from COVID. Almost no young people were really seriously ill, and a very tiny number of deaths amongst, obviously tragic where they've occurred, but amongst young people who had very significant vulnerabilities, in that handful of cases. But overwhelmingly, children and young people were not really badly affected by COVID in the way that older and more vulnerable people, very clearly were. So in participating in that lockdown and in giving up a significant part of their youth or childhood in the way that they did, I do feel that all young people have, really genuinely given a national service, and we as adults now owe them and deserve, and should be looking to pay them back. And I suppose we see ourselves, as the adults working in education, as the people at the forefront of giving back now to young people. And, when I say that they've lost out, I don't just mean in terms of their lessons, I mean, in terms of their, ability to go outside, to develop, not just intellectually, but socially, in terms of their physical development. Visibly in some of our schools, children have put on weight or are less healthy or less fit, as well as having experienced, and we are seeing, and I know that this is a sort of, some people are kind of question this focus on mental health in the modern world, but I think it's very hard to look at what's going on in schools and with young people now and not actually be genuinely quite concerned about all of those things. So we've got this big sense of recovery is not just an academic thing, though it is an academic thing. It's a much broader thing than that. And then secondly, alongside that, your family circumstances and your wealth, not to put too fine a point on it, hugely affect what level of disadvantage you've experienced over the last 2 years. So, you know, if you are on the 12th, you live on the 12th floor of a block of flats, and you know, have no space of your own, and you share a room, and your initial you know, access to education could only be through a parent's mobile phone because that's all you had, and you know, that had to be shared with siblings, and you had no quiet place to work, and there was no garden for you to go out in, and your experience of lockdown was very significantly different to somebody, you know, who had different home circumstances. So, you know, I would say all young people have experienced harm and loss, and there is a recovery job for all young people, but it is, you know, very much more severe for some young people than for others. So, I mean, we are trying to respond to all of that, in short. You know, we are looking to, you know, do more in terms of our extracurricular and co-curricular activities, give more opportunities for, you know, the sport and the music and the drama and the self-expression that people have missed. But we're also trying to make sure that, you know, the quality of every lesson is of the highest standard, that we really are identifying what children do and don't understand, identifying gaps and filling them, putting in place one-to-one tuition for pupils, you know, in much greater, to a much greater extent than we've had before, and looking to try and fill all of those gaps as best we can, try to make sure that young people, as far as we possibly can, are being put back on a track to making a success of their lives. It isn't, so John, I don't think, a 1-year job. Sorry.
No, not at all. Now, of course, you were on an Ofsted advisory committee, and I know that in early 2021 you resigned from it over the government's attitude to testing and assessment during the pandemic, and you have to rehearse all of that. But do you think the government acted as was required to support schools and the students in particular? I know you're in the Department of Education now. In one of their offices,
so I am physically in the DFE at this moment, because I have been to another advisory meeting, so I have to be nice about them, don't I? I mean, well, look, I mean, the government made an absolute pig's ear of exams, didn't they? Two years in a row, and I don't think I can be accused of being wise after the event, because I tried to warn them for some months before the event about what was going to happen, and it's just frustrating that that happened, because I don't think it was necessary, and I think it could all have been better handled. And I think they, you know, this is difficult, isn't it? Because nobody's dealt with a pandemic before, and people are having to make things up as they go along, and trying to do things as well as they can from the start. But I think they made a series of mistakes which were not just predictable, but were actually predicted. And you know, they were given direct advice: if you do this, this will happen. And they did it, and it happened. So that's frustrating. I feel like we're in a much better place now, you know, I think there's a very serious attempt from the DFE at the moment to engage well with people, you know, to listen carefully. There is a new leadership in Ofqual. Obviously, there's new political leadership in the DFE, and you know, people are working hard to consult and involve and listen to the to practitioners in the system as well as they can. So
things are changing.
Yeah.
I mean, you've talked to us now about, you know, the impact on children's self-expression in drama, music, sport, even, you know, kids getting fat because they're not getting the exercise. And obviously, with respect to the English-speaking union, we're very concerned about the impact on young people's voice, you know, their ability to communicate orally. One of the things that impresses me and a lot of other people about your trust, John, is you talk about words and numbers being our most powerful ways of representing the world, and that powerful knowledge is not static or backward looking. And one, as you say, it includes the ability to critique, challenge, status quo, think and learn. And that's very much what we do with the ESU, trying to get children to speak and listen and challenge and be confident communicators and critical thinkers. So To what extent do you think that school children lost the fluency of language during COVID, and what was the impact of that on their learning?
Yes, I mean, I think that absolutely was an issue, and obviously for the youngest children, and again, disadvantage here is a significant factor. For the youngest children, joining our schools in nurseries and reception classes and so on, you see this very wide variation in the level of language that children have. From, you'll see sometimes children joining reception classes, as rising 5-year-olds, still speaking in 2-word sentences and having a very limited vocabulary. And obviously some of that we try to tackle through the early years provision, the nurseries and so on, where there's an attempt to create a kind of language-rich environment in which children are developing a broader vocabulary and expressing themselves. And of course, that continues all the way through schooling, and often in primary schools, there's a good deal of collaborative learning. There are things where a lot of our primary schools will group children in tables of 4, and there are quite structured activities which are in the course of many lessons, which are about children talking to each other in their 4s on their tables in a particular way. And obviously this is about developing language and expression and the ability to articulate your thoughts. And of course, that's then linked to their ability to read and in due course to write as well. So, the development of language is obviously a complex process, but it involves all of those things at once. So yes, I mean, in short, we are worried about the development of children's language. During the pandemic in our academies, we went out and acquired, in the end, some 30,000 devices for pupils, Chromebooks or laptops or similar, so that they could properly access lessons, and they were not reliant on parents' mobile phones to join in with lessons, and so that we could reliably make sure that everybody was, not just sort of listening to a recorded lesson, but actually able to actively participate in lessons and to communicate with teachers and classmates. But inevitably, one's ability to do that well online, which I think did develop, teachers obviously learned a lot about how to do this better as time went on.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
But there's no doubt that children missed out from, not being able to speak face to face to adults. You can imagine if you're teaching phonics, where you're trying to sound out words, for example, and help children to understand the connection between, the written grapheme, so-called, and the phonic sound that will typically make. That is a process which it's quite difficult to do well over Teams or Zoom or whatever. So all of these things mean we've got a big catch-up job to do, and it runs all the way through school.
So do you think your schools were, by and large, say in the secondary sector, were you able to have history lessons discussing issues and, say, science lessons looking at ethics? Did that actually happen? So it wasn't just giving work to do and PowerPoints and then working through it.
Yes, and I mean, some of this is where our scale is, just really came into its own and was an enormous advantage. So right from the start, we were producing centrally, using very skilled teachers and producing for everybody recorded lessons. So, asynchronous lessons, so-called. There were PowerPoint slides and voiceover PowerPoint and actual lessons being recorded. And the benefit of having, and now we have a complete bank across the entire curriculum, all the core national curriculum subjects. We have these asynchronous lessons, videoed lessons, and every young person in the trust can go onto our curriculum website. And now, if they want to review what was England like before the Normans arrived, and they can go and review that lesson, see it online, listen to a different teacher explaining it to them. So we've got that enormous bank of lessons, and that was really important at the outset when we couldn't. So going back to this example of the student on their mum's mobile phone, sharing that phone with a sibling, you couldn't guarantee that that child would be able to tune into the lesson at the right time, but you could guarantee that they'd be able to listen to the recorded lesson at some stage during the day and do the work that you'd set them. Now, the reason we then bought 30,000 devices is because we really wanted there to be proper face-to-face lessons. And if you remember back in 2020, there was a shortage of chips in the world. And so we couldn't get all 30,000 straight away. But quite quickly, we got to the point where we were able to guarantee that every child in the trust had a laptop or a Chromebook, something of that sort, through which they could, take part actively in live lessons. And in, later lockdown periods, we had an expectation that every one of our secondary schools would be teaching at least 4 hours of live lessons every day, supplemented by recorded lessons if necessary, but making sure that, 4 hours isn't quite a full school day, because there are some things that was quite difficult to do live, but at least as a minimum 4 hours live every day, so that some of that interaction could happen, in a natural way during a live lesson. So again, we were in a very kind of fortunate position, I think, because of our scale of being able to do all of those things. Really,
yeah, it's extraordinary, John. There were lots of children living near to me who were doing next to nothing, at least for the first lockdown. And so fantastic that you could do that, and it's a great advert for your trust and the power of trusts. I suppose I'd like to move now to looking at education for the future, which is obviously one of our key topics, and spend the last of our time before we open to questions looking at your thoughts on this. And I know that you've spoken previously of the need for considerable educational resilience amongst ed teachers as they sort of navigate the policy versus curriculum dichotomy. What do you mean by that? And I suppose also that follows on, what is the place of education beyond simply passing exams, important as they are?
Yes, I mean, I suppose my thinking on how easy it is for heads to ignore the passing fads of policy has probably matured a bit whilst I've been in this role. I started thinking, well, look, I've just spent the last 15 years of my life, spending all my time on policy thinking, trying to work out what ought we to do and how ought we to do it. And it should be relatively straightforward to give heads the confidence, to think in the same way for themselves, what ought we to do and how ought we to do it. But of course, that was a bit naive, and heads feel, for a variety of good and bad reasons, under a great deal of pressure to do what, as it were, they feel they're being instructed to do, and to deliver against league tables and Ofsted accountability measures and so on. So we have a series of principles in the organisation. Powerful knowledge is one of them. And the powerful knowledge principle recognises that getting good exam results does in fact matter. If you want to get into a selective university or a selective course, you're going to need some pretty good A-level grades, and there's no getting away from that. But also that isn't the be-all and end-all, and we shouldn't be, spending all of a child's education teaching them how to answer exam questions, which frankly can be a real issue. I know from my own children's experience that my eldest daughter, who's now through university, I thought was an absolute genius at kind of understanding what you needed to do to answer a 6-mark question, and this is the structure of the answer that you have to give. And ask a sort of more general or searching question about the topic, and she'd tell me that was irrelevant. And so,
Yes.
So, you know, there is this real pressure on schools that translates very readily to teachers. And I think, you know, so we have this powerful knowledge principle, which is saying, you know, what it takes to be knowledgeable and act powerfully in the world is much more than an exam question, although in the end, you know, you have to be able to succeed at that. But also we have this education with character principle, which comes originally from a saying of Gandhi's. He talked about 7 deadly sins of modern life. He talked about knowledge without character as a deadly sin of modern life. So we talk about powerful knowledge and we talk about education with character. And that sense that we're trying to develop the whole person, that we're trying to develop service, and life skills and confidence and articulacy and the ability to work with others and in teams, and to pursue your interests and passions. And we hope to develop some lifelong interests and passions in young people as well, because that's also an important part of a happy and a fruitful life, isn't it? So so yeah, we try to kind of deeply embed that in all our work.
But do you find that assessment is driving the curriculum? Certainly, I think we in the English Speaking Union feel that oracy, speaking and listening, is being pushed out because it's simply not assessed. And if you can't weigh it, a lot of people aren't going to teach it. So how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, so the theory of assessment and accountability is you have a curriculum that you're teaching, you teach the curriculum really well, and then you assess the curriculum that you've taught. And obviously you have to sample the curriculum, but you sample the whole curriculum and you get a valid assessment of whether people have understood what you've taught. And then the accountability system at the end of it tells you who has done a good job based on the assessments of enabling children to understand the whole curriculum. But unfortunately, what we see is instead of that sort of left to right progression, curriculum, assessment, accountability, you end up with a kind of backwards, right to left sort of drive in which the accountability system puts a huge amount of pressure on the assessment system. And so things like oracy or experimental science is another good example.
Yes.
You know, because they can't be assessed in a fully kind of 100% reliable, absolutely replicable way, get squeezed out of the assessment because they can't be reliably used in the accountability system. So you get this, you know, pressure on accountability, meaning that anything which can be manipulated by teachers or parents get taken out of the assessment system because the pressure of accountability, you know, there has been, for example, in relation to coursework, very good evidence that in fact there is what, you know, you might informally call cheating in coursework by parents and even teachers because of the pressures of the accountability. So the accountability has this perverse effect on assessment, and when something drops out of the assessment system, it can have a perverse effect on the curriculum. And you find that if oracy or you know, an oral examination in modern foreign language, or as I say, experimentation in science isn't part of the assessment in the same way, then it drops out of the curriculum or becomes, you know, very much deprioritized in the curriculum. So it is, I think, genuinely a concern. And, you know, it takes a kind of courageous leader of a school to sort of push back against that. Yeah. And say, you know what, well, maybe we won't get much credit for it in the league tables, but we're doing it anyway because it's right.
Okay, so come on, courageous leader, and we know you are. How do you help your learners see speaking in public and, you know, as the norm, which they can all do, and not just the clever ones who've always got their hands up?
Yeah, and so there's a whole variety of answers to that. Some of that is in the ordinary practice of teaching. So, you know, hands up is a good example, isn't it? So if you have a kind of model of, well, in every lesson we have a kind of hands up, then the ones who speak are the ones who are confident to speak and want, you know, and so they are then, you know, they're then developing that skill and enhancing it and growing in confidence all the time, and everybody who isn't speaking, the opposite. So, you know, you have a process in teaching where you have something that you might call cold call, where, the teacher, rather than asking for hands up, will simply ask a student for their answer to the question. And then you have, teaching strategies which you might call right is right, where, in the kind of methodology that is used in a lot of our schools, where if somebody says something which is a half-formed sentence or doesn't quite get the right answer or doesn't use the technical vocabulary very well, then you help them to kind of reformulate their answer so that rather than being more or less right and the teacher correcting it, the student is the one who's articulating. So I'm just giving you examples of things that you do in lessons. You try to make sure that all of your practice every day is designed well to get good conversation happening in the classroom and involving all children, no matter what their level of confidence and ability. And then you try to make sure that you have specific activities, again, in lessons, which are designed to make sure, everyone is going to present on an interest or a hobby. Everyone is going to talk about, however, in briefly it through. And then you have, in what's called the hidden curriculum, the sort of ordinary kind of practices of what happens in the corridors and what's the expectation of students engaging with teachers and their fellow students in the corridors. And then you have the co-curricular. So how are we going to make sure that everybody has opportunities to take part in drama or to speak or to debate? It needs to run through the whole practice of a school. From everything that's happening routinely in the classroom to specifically designed activities.
I'm so glad we're interviewing you. You are a head and a CEO after my own heart, and that of the ESU, I think. So before we come to questions, one last question for you, John, and perhaps it's a bit of an unfair question. So you've done both educational policy, telling others what to do, and you've been the leader who has been helping your own students to do things. What would you tell your younger self about to join the DFE, what to do, and what is your key message to policymakers now?
Well, first with my younger self, I'm not sure how much I'd want to change, really. I mean, I joined the DFE at what I consider to be the kind of golden age of the DFE, really. For the first time in history, in the sort of later years of the major government and from the Blair government onwards, education became or at times the central priority of government, and education and the education department, education policy, felt like the place to be. And the department, for the first time really in its history, was engaging really quite deeply with schools, the education system, and looking to change things. And you mentioned I spent a lot of time doing class sizes and implementing the class size pledge. Well, I was very proud of my work on that, and we, the job was make sure no infant child is in a class of more than 30, and we delivered that. So that was great. I now know that doesn't make any difference, really. So
in the education theory, yes.
So there's a lot more research on class size, and it tends to show that having smaller class sizes doesn't make very much difference at all. However, I learned a huge amount from doing that, which has enormously prepared me for other things. So even the things that are not perfect by any means, or where you've invested lots of time and effort, and actually you wonder whether that was worth, the amount I learned from that was huge. So,
but I think almost no parents and no teachers agree that it doesn't affect it, even though
I know
research shows that. We all feel that instinctively, don't we?
I know.
More chance in a small class. That's what parents pay for, of course, in private education. So what's your advice to policymakers now, John? What do you think the key thing they've got to get right?
By the way, the reason that that's true is if you take any one teacher and you make their class smaller, the chances are it probably does help. But in doing that, you have to have a whole load more teachers. And so what you end up doing is having a slightly less good teaching workforce. So that appears to be why at a system level, it doesn't make very much difference.
Yeah.
What would I say to policymakers now? Well, so what I always used to try and teach policymakers was that there were three things that you had to get right. in policy, and I used to do kind of teaching policy across government, and the first is the political. So if you imagine I'm a mathematician, so this is a Venn diagram, 3 overlapping circles, and circle 1 is the political. If you take any policy area or any problem that you're trying to solve, area 1, circle 1 is politically, what would this lot do? What would these politicians do? What would they think was a good type of answer to this solution? Because there's never any point proposing a policy solution which politically isn't popular. Politicians will not do something that they don't want to do and they think is the wrong kind of political answer. So that's circle 1. You have to understand that well. Second thing is what's deliverable, what's doable. And most policy disasters come from a kind of irresistible political force meeting an immovable delivery obstacle. Politicians are absolutely determined to do something and you can't do it for whatever reason, and you end up with a fridge mounted or a air traffic control system which never opens, or all of these things which have happened over time. So that's number 2. And to understand that, you've got to really understand the system. You've got to engage with people. You've got to know how the resources work. You've got to work out what are the kind of levers that you can pull and can't pull, and what are the things that where are the incentives in the system. And then the third thing you've got to worry about is what does the evidence say actually works and makes a difference. So I used to say to people doing policy, look, we don't wake up in the morning, do we, to do something that politicians want to do, which happens to be doable. We wake up in the morning to do something which is going to make a difference. And it's so common, I would say, that people do something that's doable and is politically popular. And there are many, many, many examples in education policy where there's no match between that and the evidence. So you have to imagine this Venn diagram. What's politically desirable, what's doable, and what's the evidence show is actually going to work. And you have to imagine that in this Venn diagram, there's a little tiny bit in the middle where the 3 circles overlap. And that's the policy sweet spot. And the job of the policymaker is to get into the policy sweet spot. And usually you cannot do that by wrapping a wet towel around your head, sitting in, Whitehall and trying to work out what the kind of clever answer is. You can only get there by experimentation, by trying, by refining in the light of experience, by listening to people, and by engaging well with people, and just by really deeply trying to know and understand and immerse yourself in the education system. And that's what we need from policymakers.
Thank you very much. So lots of questions have come in the chat. So Jenny has asked the question that about Michael Gove, obviously a former education secretary and a very influential one. And she says that obviously levelling up is now, that's Michael Gove's project he's been given to do. What advice are you giving him, or would you be giving him, about how we level up in terms of the education of our children?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really difficult challenge, and I noticed Mike Graydon earlier on asking about white working class children and the problem there, and that certainly still is a problem. We do have a north-south divide in education, as in many other things, and so the government's doing some things which I think are sensible here. So they've got this idea of education priority areas and putting additional resource into that, and looking to attract stronger teachers through paying incentives to bring people in. And all of that's fine and sensible. They're looking to use strong trusts and to bring strong trusts into areas where there aren't strong trusts and where things are not as good as they should be. And so all of those things are sensible. I just think they're not at the scale required. So if you took London Challenge, we had a citywide strategy, and let me answer this question that's just appeared in the chat. I think the key thing is we had a citywide strategy which really tried to focus on very specifically, in quite a granular way, what are the things that are problematic here on the one hand, and what are the strengths that London's got? Because of course, London's got enormous strengths as the centre of all sorts of high productivity industries and so on. So how do you really tackle actually meaningfully, place by place, what are the barriers, what's getting in the way, why can't we get teachers, or which teachers are we losing, and what are the strengths of the areas and how are we going to use those? so I think I would sort of, in education, if I wanted, if I said, what would it take to level up? Many of the things government's doing really sensible, but kind of multiplied by a factor of 10, really, to actually get the kind of scale of impact that's needed.
And John, how about in counties, where there's lots of small towns and villages as opposed to the big cities? So looking at Lincolnshire, for example, which a lot of people on this chat are from Lincolnshire, how do we help sort of rural communities and where there's travel's a big issue?
Yeah, and one thing that is good about the levelling up agenda is that I think people are recognising that it isn't just about cities. So it's not just about urban deprivation. There is a recognition that, there are coastal issues of coastal deprivation. Often the coast is a very difficult place to run a school because, trying to get teachers when, half your kind of catchment is the sea is just difficult. And, for rural areas, it's often very small primary schools which can struggle to attract and retain good teachers and so on. So there are no easy answers, I would say, to geography, but I think there are some very good, and Lincolnshire does have some very good examples of trusts or federations where some of the best leaders of schools take responsibility for more schools, and very good heads I know in Lincolnshire who've done that and have taken responsibility for schools that are struggling or don't have capability, and really have made a very big difference to those schools. Trying to make sure. Sorry, Matthew, go on.
No, continue. You continue. Sorry, I was interrupting.
Well, I was just going to say that then trying to make sure that you've systematically got high quality training and development at every stage of career, and that's available to people wherever they are, is also a key part of creating area-wide improvement. So again, that's sometimes something that's easier to do in a city than it is in a rural area. But again, I think there are models where, again, trusts or what are called teaching school alliances have done that extremely well.
There's a couple of questions that come up in the chat about one of the problems being that teaching hasn't got much kudos, and I'm not sure it even has after the pandemic, where parents realised they didn't want to be teachers and they'd like the teachers to do it, please. How can we get teaching to be seen as a really worthwhile profession and to get it to be paid at a rate that will attract top graduates?
Yeah. Well, look, it's a well-known fact that there are two things which affect the kudos of a profession. One is pay and the other is qualification level, by and large. So the more high qualified a profession is and the better paid it is, the higher level of regard and respect it has. So the obvious thing that you can affect is pay, and as a government, the government is looking to particularly increase starting salaries, and over the next couple of years, make sure that every teacher is paid at least £30,000. I think that's reasonable as a starting point. But we are seeing, during the pandemic, levels of turnover went down, levels of interest in the profession went up, and that is always counter-cyclical with the economy. When graduate jobs are scarce, people want to be teachers in greater numbers, unsurprisingly. So all of that has fallen away, though, now. So actually, turnover rates are rising to their pre-pandemic level, and recruitment challenges are actually slightly worse this year than they were in 2019 for new graduates coming into the profession. So I think the government probably is going to have to do more on pay than it's currently proposing if it's going to make the profession as attractive as it needs to be. And one of the things that we have as an academy trust is greater freedom over these things. So we do in fact pay people more because we think that's necessary to get great people into our schools. And I think the government is going to have to follow that path.
And John, the last question actually is Camilla's question, our host, and she says, your trust, for instance, could adopt some of the programs that we in the charity sector are offering, and certainly ESU, we've got programs like Discover Your Voice and other programs to really help teachers to learn how to deliver oracy well and to help students participate in a fun and successful way. How do we get into trusts like yours and persuade them, because you're so busy? How do we get into trusts like yours and say what we're offering is really important? I'm sure every charity worker out there would like an answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, I mean, there are trusts which are much more kind of centralized in their mindset than us. So we don't go around telling people you must adopt this, program or what have you. So what really works is, and one of the reasons why we don't do that is because generally speaking, the quality of a program as actually enacted and delivered in a school does depend on the school buying into it and leaders in the school wanting it to happen and wanting it to work well and believing in it. So what works actually is, working with one or two schools, maybe more, but, initially working with a small number of schools which see the value and the merit of the program and are interested in it and excited by it and have at least one leader who's kind of passionate about it and really wants to make it work. And then, really actually making it work in 2 or 3 schools. And once we've got that, the people that heads believe are other heads, generally speaking. So, once you've got something that's really working, you'll find that, senior people in our trust will see that working and think, oh, that's good. And then they'll ask those heads to say, well, is it as good as it looks? And then will you kind of talk to other heads in the trust about it? And we have these opportunities called group education forums where all our heads come together and people share their practices and the things that are working for them. So then the word of mouth tends to grow because people start to see, well, it's working for them. So that I would advise is the model. That'll certainly be the model that worked with us, I suspect, with quite a lot of other trusts as well.
And we are working obviously with some of your schools already, both private and state. So we'll be targeting you with your wonderful 5 principles. Have you got time for one more question, John?
Yeah.
So Steph has asked, what would your top advice be to new student teachers to encourage them to gain the skills that will help them survive the first few years? I remember those first few years.
My advice is train with United Learning. We have actually, quite seriously, we have a program called United Teaching. It's extremely good. You get a really high quality mentoring and support. There's an extremely good initial teacher training curriculum and what's called the Early Careers Framework, which is a new, relatively new government initiative, which is about supporting teachers through their first 2 or 3 years. We have experience now of running 2 and 3 year initial teacher training programs for quite some time. And so the quality of support you get, the nature of the training and development, and the support you get to deal with the difficult issues when you're starting out is second to none in my view. But if you can't train with United Teaching, then you should look very carefully at the teacher training program that you are going to follow and make sure that you are with a provider which has that sort of level of support, mentoring, aftercare, continued support over the first 2 or 3 years of your employment, because that's the key thing. Do you get trained in a very high quality environment with high expectations, in which you learn on the basis of the very best evidence? What are the practices which work and make a difference?
Well, before I hand over to Mike Graydon, who's the chair of Lincolnshire, can I say, John, thank you very much. It's been great. It would have been even better had we had time like Desert Island Disc for your 8 records, but maybe next time, if the BBC let us steal their idea. But thank you very much, and I've really enjoyed it. I know the audience have too. But now over
pleasure.
to you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to step in for a minute to say thank you to both yourself, Sir Jon, and to Matthew. And it really has been thought-provoking and very entertaining. But Mike, I'm going to hand over to you now, to the chairman of the Lincolnshire branch of the English-speaking union, Sir Mike Graydon.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for pulling all the strings and getting it going in the first place. John and I go back quite a long way, so he won't mind if I remember one or two things that we discussed in our time. But what was a joy to me tonight to see your emphasis on some of the things that mattered so much to me, on the life skills, the communication skills as part of that whole education process. And you shouldn't be measuring them. You should be inculcating those in people. And it seems to me that is what you are doing so skillfully in United Learning. And if ever there was an advertisement for big is beautiful on this occasion, I think United Learning is it, because the opportunities that John has shared with us for teacher training, for example, which I think does need a serious review, because I think it is way behind the times in some way. Indeed, a lot of the teachers could do with some oracy training themselves, from what I've seen. But you've got that, John. You've got the life skills. You've got all of these things going, and the career management for teachers again is benefited hugely by having an academy chain behind them. So it's a real advert for, I think, what one has to go back to the Labour government and say their vision for what could be done with this was remarkable, and it has, I think, worked. And I don't hear too much muttering about comprehensive schools and how terrible it all was that this academy chain system was introduced. That's great news. John, thank you very much for giving your time. Matthew, great questions, I thought, excellent, and it really brought out the whole range of the education process, which I think everybody in their right mind would agree is the most important thing that we can do in this country for its future, is to get that right. And United Learning seems to me be doing a great job to that end. Thank you very much for your time, John. Look forward to seeing you before too long. And thank you, everybody, for attending on what has been, I think, a brilliant evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, all.